Hello everyone, welcome back to this series of lessons on English literature. Today we're going to look at Joseph Conrad. So he had a pretty interesting life. He was born in what it is today Ukraine, considered Ukraine, and he had Polish parents, so he spoke Polish, and but he's considered a English writer because he decided to learn English and to write in English. And after his many trips, um, he moved to England. He married an English woman, and he stayed there. So his father was an activist and a writer and a translator, and he was arrested. And his mother died when he was pretty young. He was 11. So he stayed with his uncle until he decided to leave for France because he did not want to fight in the Russian army and to get enrolled in the Russian army. So he left France and he left Ukraine and he went to France where he enrolled in the Marina. So he started traveling at sea, which he loved, and he traveled a lot, many trips, and during these many trips he took inspiration for his many novels and books. One of his trips were he went to Congo, and that trip inspired his famous book Heart of Darkness. We can understand some things about him by the fact that in a period of break from traveling, he was in France and he was broke. He did not have any money, and in that moment, he was around 20, I think. He attempted suicide. But then, after he stopped working at sea on ships, he married an English woman. He moved to England, and he lived there. So he spoke Polish and French really well, and but he decided that he wanted to write in English. So he's considered, even if he's not English, he's considered an English novelist. Even if he lived in the second half and at the second half of the 1800s and at the beginning of the 20th century, he's considered an early modernist because he understood that the structure, the classical structure of the romance, of the novel, could not represent in a accurate way the complexity of the human being, of the human psyche, and of the human consciousness. So his novel are not in structure and in form are not revolutionary as the modernist novel, but it starts to represent the inner self and the complexity of the inner self, which is a characteristic of the modernists. So one of the theme that is present in many of his novels is imperialism and colonialism. Of course, in his many trips, he was able to see the effects of imperialism and colonialism, and he was able to see how evil it was and how useless we can say it was. So in his book, and in particular in Heart of Darkness, he criticizes it and he looks at colonialism in a really critical way. So as I said before too, he looks at the human psyche and the complexity of it and the darkness that's inside every one of us. So he always question morality. So he puts into question obvious values that were considered obvious, such as colonialism, which was not considered something bad. and he puts them into question, and he criticizes them. So other than being considered an early modernist, he's also considered a colonial writer because he represents what it is to live in the colonies, not only in the perspective of the population that was already living in the colonies, so the natives, but also from the perspective of the people who are colonizing the country. So Heart of Darkness is a novel that we're going to look at, and it's his most famous novel. The first edition was published in 1902. And really briefly, the plot, the main character is called Marlowe. He's a sailor, and he decides to make a trip to Africa, and he takes a job as a riverboat captain for a company that organizes trade in Congo. So for a company that works and for the empire, the English Empire, and has colonized Congo for the many material that you can find in Congo. So the novel follows his trip in Congo and describes the brutality of the company, of the treatments that they have for the native population. There's a really famous passage where he describes the chains and the sound of the chains to which the native population were attached while working. And also he describes really well the wilderness and the jungles that characterized Congo. And he describes it as a vast darkness because it is a territory which is not supposed to be conquered, is not supposed to be discovered and looked at, because just brings a vast darkness and is not a civilized place. So he has a mission. He has to arrive at Kurt's inner station, which was a really important station for the trade of ivory. And he has to arrive there because they say that Kurt is ill, and they need to go and get him to basically save the station. And during the trip, he hears many things about Kurtz and the fact that he was, before going to Congo, he was a really good captain with many good qualities, but now it seems like he has gone mad. And so it's a really ambiguous character because during the whole novel, we cannot understand if he's a good character, a bad character, but we understand that there is something wrong with him. So Marlowe, during his trip, understands that Kurt has gone mad while staying in Congo, in the deep wilderness of Congo. When they reach the station, they understand that Kurt has been there and he has become a sort of god among the natives. Marlowe meets this Russian man who stayed for a while in the station, in Kurt's station, and he saw that the natives kind of worshipped him as he was a god. And we also understand that that was because probably he was evil and really mean to them, so they were also very afraid of him. So we see that Kurt has gone mad and he's really ill, so they take him away from the station, and before dying, Kurt gives to Marlowe different papers and also a report that he was commissioned and he had written on how to civilize the savages. And Marlowe reads the last words of this paper, and the last words were exterminate all the brutes. So it's another thing that another aspect from which we understand that Kurtz is not in his right mind. And the last words of Kurtz before dying were the horror, the horror. So we can see that inside of him grew a really darkness that took him. So Marlowe, after Kurtz dies, he falls ill too. He's close to die, but he recovers and he goes back to England, and he visits what was Kurtz's fiancée. He had to marry in England, and he does not want to tell her that Kurtz was evil and became evil by staying in Congo. And the Marlowe fiancé asks him what his last words were, and he does not want to tell her that his last words were the horror. So he tells her that his last words were of saying and her love for her. And that is the end of the novel. So, of course, one of the main important themes of the novel is imperialism. He criticizes imperialism and colonialism and what brings to the native population and the treatment that imperialism causes on them. And of course, he criticizes the hypocrisy of colonialism, because it is supposed to be seen as a good thing because it brings civilization to this population who were not, in their view, civilized. But by doing so, they mistreat them, they exploit them. So there is this hypocrisy at the base of imperialism, and in his strips, Conrad sees that, and he criticizes it in his books. So there is, even if it is believed that there is a moral substance underneath and on the basis of colonialism, there is not. And he underlines this particular aspect. So we can see that the darkness is inside of the European civilization and the European colonization. Many interpret the heart of darkness as the fact that by moving into non-civilized places, we take out some kind of darkness that is inside us, and we get influenced by also the darkness of the place, and we become evil. So, of course, the other main theme is the madness. And this is central for what I was saying, that Conrad looks at the inner self and the subconscious and the complexity of the human being. Because one of the interpretation of the book is that it is a trip to Congo, an actual trip to Congo, but it symbolizes a trip into the inner self. A trip in particular into darkness. And this is what I was saying before, that by the fact of moving from a civilized place towards a wilderness, a wild place, we move and we go back into civilization, and we find out, we discover something about ourselves that is really dark. And that is what happened, what Marlowe understands, that is what happened to Kurtz. Because Kurtz, by staying in that wild place, by staying in a place that was not civilized, he discovered who he really was, that there was some darkness inside of him, and the wilderness of Congo, of Africa, took that darkness out and showed it to the world, and he went mad because of that. So, of course, there's this symbolism of the trip into darkness, and the darkness is inside of us, so it's a trip into the inner self. and of course into the wilderness, because they go from a civilized place to a wild place with what they thought was no civilization. So that caused the madness. And of course, also the darkness in the title, The Heart of Darkness, is also considered imperialism. The being exposed to the evil of imperialism and colonialism, and the power that brings, because when you feel like you have power, as Kurtz in the station, he had power over the native population. He went mad because he started to think he was a god. He had the power to exploit them. So one thing that Marlowe understands from all the things he hears about Kurtz, is that before going to Congo, he wasn't mad at all. On the contrary, he was a really famous person who had many good qualities, and he was considered a good man. So it was Congo that caused that transformation. It was the wilderness of Congo that caused that transformation. So you can see that there are some aspects that were typical of the modernist novels. We're going to just look at a couple of quotes that are really characteristics of all the things that I said before. The first is, "But the wilderness had found him. The wilderness had found him out early and had taken him a terrible vengeance for the fantastic invasion. I think it has whispered to him things about himself which he did not know, things of which he had no conception till he took counsel with this great solitude, and the whisper had proved irresistibly fascinating." So here we see the wilderness that is alive and is able to whisper things on in Kurtz's ear, and telling him something about himself that we do not know, and that he didn't know, and those things were too fascinating to him and he couldn't resist them, so he's gone mad. So we can see that the wilderness is a trip inside the self, is a trip where you can discover something of yourself, and that causes you to go mad. And here is another, this one is a criticism of colonialism, because you can see what the power of having things and having power over people makes you go mad. And he says, Marlowe, by describing Kurtz's, he says, "You should have heard him say, 'My Ivory, oh yes, I heard him. My intendant, my Ivory, my station, my river, my everything belonged to him.'" So the fact that thinking that everything belongs to you brings something out of yourself that is dark. So here on this one, we can see that Marlowe describes the trip inside the wilderness as going back in civilization. So from going to a civilized place, to something wild that is not civilized and that is really dangerous. And he says, "Going up that river was like traveling back to the earliest beginnings of the world, when vegetation rioted on the earth and the big trees were kings." So the big trees were kings means that before civilization, the nature ruled over the world, the wilderness ruled over the world. And wilderness, Conrad thinks and Marlowe thinks, was not a place for humans, because it was dangerous. It made you find out things that were not good for yourself and for your mind. Here we see another proof of Kurt's madness and the madness that powers bring, because he describes, here is the Russian guy that Marlowe meets at the station. He describes the heads that were on stakes right in front of Kurtz's house. and they were facing the house. They were not facing the outside of the house. So you can understand that they did not have any function there. They were just trophies. They were just things to show the world his power. So the Russian says they would have been even more impressive, those heads on stakes, if their faces had not been turned to the house. I want you to understand that there was nothing exactly profitable in those heads being there. They only showed that Mr. Kurtz lacked restraint in the gratification of his various lusts, that there was something wanting in him. So it was just to scare people and show them that he could have everything and there was no limits for him, and he always wanted more. So this is just one last quote that says, "The word ivory rang in the air, was whispered, was cited. You would think they were praying to it. A taint of imbecile rapacity blew through it all, like a whip from some corpse. I've never seen anything so unreal in my life, and outside the silent wilderness surrounding this clear speck on the earth struck me as something great and invincible, like evil or truth, waiting patiently for the passing away of the fantastic invasion." So here, Conrad is criticizing imperialism, and Marlowe describes that in one of the stations where he stops in his trip, he describes the people who talk about ivory, and they talk about ivory as something almost is not an object anymore. It is something to worship. So he said you would think they were praying to it, and he shows how the wanting of things, of material things, of richness, of wealth, makes you kind of not looking at the important thing in life, but worship the wrong things, the material things. So he describes this image of decaying corpse. He says, "A taint of imbecile rapacity blew through it all, like a whiff from some corpse." So it's just to say that imperialism is something that brings to death, and it cannot bring anything good. So we've seen, just in a really brief way, Conrad and what the main characteristics of Conrad. I hope everything was clear for you, and in particular, everything was clear in the book Heart of Darkness. And this is all for this lesson, and I'll see you for the next lesson.